A tuning fork sitting in the British Library right now proves that every piano on Earth is tuned to a frequency Beethoven never used, and the story of how that happened involves governments, melted bronze, and the deliberate silencing of an entire acoustic world. There is a tuning fork inside the British Library. It once belonged to Ludwig van Beethoven. It vibrates at 455.4 Hertz, not 440, not 432, a frequency that nobody in the modern world is even debating anymore. Every concert hall piano on this planet is calibrated to a standard its most famous composer never once heard. His fork sits sealed behind glass, a preserved echo of a sound the modern world quietly walked away from. And here is what makes that worth your attention. Beethoven's frequency was not some eccentric outlier. It was completely ordinary for his era. What we now call the universal standard would have registered to his ear as flat, hollow, and simply wrong. The pitch we all inherited was not uncovered through science. It was selected through politics, and everything that existed before it was physically removed from the world. If you have followed my previous work on the million bells destroyed across 3 centuries of European history, you already understand the scale of what was lost. This is about something deeper than the metal itself. It is about what those bells carried. Not the bronze, not the raw tonnage governments claimed they urgently needed. The frequency, the specific pitch each bell held, tuned by families of specialist founders who transferred that knowledge from one generation to the next across hundreds of years. That sound no longer exists anywhere, and the process by which it vanished was far more deliberate than the history books are comfortable admitting. Before 1711, there was no reliable instrument for measuring pitch. Tuning forks had not yet been invented, no electronic references existed, no international body was setting standards. Every community on Earth calibrated its instruments to whatever the largest local instrument happened to produce, almost always the church organ. And organs varied enormously from one building to the next. 2 churches within the same city could be tuned an entire semitone apart from each other. A musician traveling from Paris to Vienna would arrive and immediately need to retune everything he owned. This was not disorder. This was the entirely natural condition of sound for most of recorded human history. Every town had its own distinct acoustic voice. The bells in your village rang at a pitch that belonged exclusively to your village. The cathedral organ resonated at a frequency shaped by the specific dimensions of that stone space. The choir matched the organ. The congregation matched the choir. The entire acoustic environment of a community vibrated at frequencies that were native to that place and nowhere else on Earth. We have hard physical evidence of just how dramatically pitch varied across time and geography. A tuning fork connected to Handel, dated 1740, vibrates at 422.5 Hertz. An unidentified specimen from 1780 registers 409. Beethoven's fork from around 1800 hits 455.4. That is a swing of 46 Hertz across 6 decades, and these were all respected musicians operating at the very center of European cultural life. French cathedral organs in the early 1800s pushed their A note as low as the 370s. The Royal Philadelphia in London moved between 433 and 455 Hertz across just 3 decades in the mid-1800s. Scottish Highland pipe bands still perform today, tuned to somewhere between 470 and 480 Hertz. The idea that any single frequency served as the natural standard before the modern era is a fiction constructed in retrospect. There was no universal standard. There were hundreds of independent frequencies, each one anchored to a specific place, a specific building, a specific bell. Then governments entered the picture. On February 16, 1859, France passed a law, not a recommendation, not a published guideline, a statutory law. It declared that the note A above middle C would vibrate at exactly 435 Hertz across all of France. They named it the diapason normal. For the first time in recorded history, a national government had legislated the vibration rate of a musical note. Hold that thought for a moment. A country that had spent the previous several decades debating the fundamental rights of human beings found the time and the institutional will to legally mandate the frequency of sound itself. The law spread outward. An 1885 conference held in Vienna extended 435 Hertz across Italy, Austria, Hungary, Prussia, Saxony, Sweden, and Württemberg simultaneously. Sound was being consolidated under centralized authority. But the story did not stop there. In 1884, Giuseppe Verdi, the most prominent opera composer alive on earth at that moment, wrote directly to the Italian government. He expressed support for the French standard, but included a telling addition. If the commission determined that mathematical considerations justified lowering the pitch to 432 Hertz, he would align himself with that position entirely and without hesitation. Italy listened. The Italian War Ministry, not a conservatory, not a musical institution, a military body, formally adopted 432 Hertz as the national standard. For exactly 1 year, Italy tuned its instruments to a frequency that certain researchers today argue aligns with deeper mathematical patterns found in nature. And then, in 1885, a conference in Vienna dominated by British delegates reversed the decision entirely. Italy dropped 432. The frequency Verdi personally endorsed, the one the Italian military had officially codified into law, was discarded within 12 months of its adoption. No Italian musicians were invited to participate in the reversal. The British delegation simply determined it was finished. Now here is where most people retelling this history make a critical error. They blame the Nazis. The claim circulates widely that Joseph Goebbels personally orchestrated a 1939 conference in London to install 440 Hertz as a tool of psychological manipulation and mass control. I spent weeks attempting to verify this claim. It falls apart entirely under examination. The 1939 conference was organized by the British Standards Institute, not by Berlin. 3 German delegates were present in the room. None of them was Goebbels. 5 French delegates attended. 3 Italian delegates attended. The nations supposedly shut out of the process were in fact seated at the table. I could build a far more dramatic video by repeating the Goebbels narrative. Millions of views live inside that story. But the true history is stranger than the conspiracy theory, because the true history requires no villain at all. It only requires you to follow what was physically destroyed. Here is a timeline that nobody has assembled in a single place before now. In 1700, Tsar Peter the Great confiscated roughly 100,000 church bells across Russia to cast into cannons following his defeat at the Battle of Narva. In 1793, the French Revolutionary Convention passed a formal decree on July 23rd. Each parish was permitted to retain 1 bell. Every remaining bell in France was to be melted down. Approximately 100,000 bells from 60,000 steeples were eliminated. 80% of all church bells in France gone within 2 years. During the Franco-Prussian War of 1870–71, the Bishop of Nancy authorized each parish in his diocese to surrender all but 1 bell for cannon production. In the First World War, 44% of all bells in Germany were confiscated or destroyed outright. Then came Soviet Decree 118, issued December 6, 1929. The Soviet government banned all bell ringing and ordered every bell across the entire nation melted down for industrial bronze. 99% of Russia's approximately 1 million bells were destroyed. 20 specialized bell foundries closed permanently. The inherited craft knowledge of Russian bell founding, transmitted through centuries of family practice, ended in a single administrative stroke. When the Soviet Union collapsed decades later and foundries attempted to reconstruct the techniques from nothing, the knowledge simply gone. Then came the Second World War. Nazi forces confiscated more than 175,000 bells across occupied Europe. Over 150,000 were destroyed. Belgium lost 2/3 of its entire bell population. British investigators documented that every single bell had been stripped from the Netherlands. Only 300 survived in a storage warehouse in Hamburg. Total those figures across 3 centuries. At minimum, 425,000 documented church bells were physically removed from European civilization through revolutions, declared wars, and government mandates. Every one of them was a precision acoustic instrument. Every one had been calibrated by trained specialists to a particular frequency. Every one functioned as the primary acoustic reference point for its surrounding community. I expected to find deliberate coordination, some organized program to systematically erase specific frequencies from human experience. That is not what the evidence shows. What I've found is, in certain ways, more troubling because it operates without any coordination at all. The French Revolution melted bells for coins and military hardware. The Soviets melted them for industrial modernization. The Nazis melted them for munitions production. 3 completely separate governments operating across 3 different centuries, driven by 3 entirely unrelated ideological motivations. The outcome, in every case, is identical. Every old acoustic reference instrument in Europe was eliminated. If this were a coordinated conspiracy, you could locate a meeting, recover a memo, identify a specific decision. But when the same result emerges from unrelated causes across 300 years, you are not observing a plan. You are observing a pattern that reproduces itself through every form of centralized power, regardless of what that power claims to believe. And here is what connects it all. The buildings those bells were specifically engineered for are still standing today. The acoustic design of these structures was not incidental. In 2016, researchers at Greek universities conducted systematic sine wave sweeps to map the acoustic characteristics of 8 Byzantine churches in Thessaloniki. What they discovered was that architects had embedded deliberate acoustic engineering directly into the construction. Clay vessels called amphorae were physically built into the walls and domed ceilings to amplify specific resonant frequencies. These were not ornamental objects, they were functional acoustic technology integrated into the architecture from the moment of construction. At Noyon Cathedral in France, researchers uncovered an underground chamber called the caveau phonocamptique, a structured array of acoustic vessels installed beneath the floor of the building's central crossing. It was designed as a monumental sound amplification system, drawing directly on architectural principles described by the Roman writer Vitruvius in the 1st century BC. Medieval construction teams selected limestone and crystalline stone varieties specifically because those particular materials conduct and sustain sound waves more effectively than alternatives. Gothic cathedrals generate reverberation times of 5 to 8 seconds. Orthodox churches range from 1.5 seconds in a small village chapel to 6 full seconds in a major cathedral. One acoustics researcher studying Orthodox ecclesiastical architecture made an observation that I have not been able to set aside since reading it. He wrote that these buildings were measurably better designed for holding sound than for holding human beings. He raised the question of whether the architects understood the painted figures on the walls and the living reverberant sound as the true permanent residents for whom the buildings had actually been constructed. You have been inside a space like this. You have felt what happens in that kind of stone room, that particular resonance below the threshold of conscious hearing, that physical sensation that the walls themselves are vibrating with something you cannot directly identify. Everyone who enters these buildings describes it. Every pilgrim and every tourist feels it. The standard explanation offered is spiritual. The space is sacred. The architecture produces awe. But consider a simpler explanation. What if it is purely acoustic? These structures were designed as instruments. The The stone, the vaulting geometry, the proportional relationships between spaces, the embedded vessels in the walls, all of it was calibrated to amplify particular frequencies. The bells rang at those frequencies. The organ was tuned to match the bells. The choir tuned to the organ. For hundreds of years, the entire building functioned as a unified resonance system, stone amplifying bronze, amplifying voice, amplifying stone in return. A closed feedback loop of sound precisely matched to the physical architecture, down to the molecular sound-conducting properties of the limestone itself. Now imagine that same system with the bells removed, the organ retuned to a new government standard, the choir following the organ. The only remaining element still vibrating at the original frequency is the building. The acoustic vessels remain in the walls. The stone still responds most readily to the same wavelengths it was built around, but nothing is driving that response anymore. The instrument is completely intact. Nobody is playing it. Contemporary churches demonstrate clearly what that loss looks like in practice. Drywall in place of load-bearing stone, carpet over marble, foam acoustic panels replacing crystalline limestone. One researcher described the result with blunt precision: too acoustically dead for singing, too live for ordinary speech. Sound absorbed unevenly, high frequencies eliminated, low frequencies turning muddy and indistinct. We compensate with microphones and speaker systems. Religious services can now be conducted in a converted retail space, but something structurally fundamental changed in that transition. Architecture stopped functioning as a component of the music itself. It became a passive container for amplified sound rather than an active generator of resonance. That distinction is not subtle. It is the difference between an instrument and a box. So what exactly was lost when 425,000 bells were melted and the entire Western world converged on a single transmitted frequency? The popular version of this debate frames it as 432 versus 440, ancient natural harmony against modern imposition. But that framing is too narrow to capture what actually happened. There was never a single ancient frequency. There were thousands of them, each one matched to a specific building in a specific geographic location, each one refined and transmitted across generations by craftsmen whose understanding of bronze metallurgy and acoustic stone we are only just beginning to document and recover. A peer-reviewed controlled study exposed 33 volunteers to music at both 432 and 440 Hz without informing them which frequency they were hearing. The group that heard 432 showed measurable reductions in resting heart rate and reported notably higher levels of focus and subjective satisfaction afterwards. 33 participants is not a large sample by the standards of clinical research, but it is a published controlled experiment, indicating that frequency is not a physiologically arbitrary variable. And if a shift of 8 Hz in a single note produces measurable physical effects in the human body, what did it mean for entire communities to live, worship, and work inside acoustically engineered buildings, buildings tuned to bells that had vibrated at the same pitch for 5 centuries? What if the real loss is not a number on a frequency chart? What if it is the underlying principle? Every community had its own sound. Every cathedral was a purpose-built instrument calibrated to its specific bells. Every bell was the product of foundry families who had spent generations refining the craft of matching bronze to stone. The acoustic character of a place was as particular to that location as its physical architecture, its local dialect, its culinary traditions. Standardization didn't simply shift a frequency by a few hertz, it replaced an entire ecology of locally distinct sound with a single reference tone broadcast from a radio transmitter. In 1936, the United States Bureau of Standards began transmitting a 440 Hz reference signal every hour from radio station WWV. Musicians across the country tuned to it. Local frequency died. The national signal took its place. The identical process repeated across every industrialized nation on Earth within decades. One pitch for every instrument, every orchestra, every recording, every broadcast, in every country, simultaneously. I am not making the argument that 432 Hz is a mystical frequency. I am not making the argument that 440 Hz was engineered as a weapon. I am making the argument that the transition from thousands of locally distinct frequencies to one globally transmitted standard was the largest single acoustic transformation in human history. And that transformation happened in the same centuries that witnessed the physical destruction of every old acoustic reference instrument in Europe. The bells are silent. The founding families are gone. The buildings that were architecturally designed to hold the original sound still stand today, their stone and their embedded clay vessels still physically favoring frequencies that no instrument is currently feeding them. The stone remembers what the world decided to forget. And the question that nobody appears willing to ask is not which frequency is the correct one. The question is, what was actually occurring inside those spaces when the building, the bell, and the human voice were all resonating at the same pitch simultaneously? What happened inside that unified resonance that we have no living experience of? What were those buildings actually doing when every component of their acoustic system was operating as the architects intended? We still have the architecture. We have the acoustic vessels embedded in walls that are 800 years old. We have reverberation times measured and published by university research teams. We have accumulating evidence that these spaces were engineered for sound with a level of sophistication that contemporary acoustics researchers are still in the process of documenting and understanding. What we do not have is the frequency. That melted with the bronze, and nobody is seriously asking what it sounded like because the people who carried that knowledge in living memory are as completely gone as the bells themselves.